For 13 long years, Silas Crowley lived in the blistering emptiness of the high desert, a place where the sky seemed too large for any one man to stand beneath and the silence could gnaw straight into a person's bones, yet he rode its horizons like a ghost who had forgotten he was still alive. Every dawn he saddled his old red roan, Copper, and pushed through the day's work with the slow, steady rhythm of a man who had no one left to hurry for. His wife, Maria, taken by fever, his son, Eli, lost in a flash flood that still woke him in the night with the roar of impossible water, and his friends scattered by time or bullets, leaving him the lone keeper of a ranch too big for a man his age but too full of memories for him to abandon. And so he stayed, surviving on roasted beans, black coffee, and the stubborn belief that a man must at least finish the work he started. But everything changed on a wind-split evening when the sun bled red against the ridges and Silas spotted three figures crouched along the far side of Tumble Creek. Slender silhouettes wrapped in shredded buckskin, faces hidden behind masks of ash and red clay, moving with a grace that made the hair on the back of Silas's neck rise because he'd heard the stories whispered in saloons and trading posts, stories of spectral Apache women said to haunt the mesas, spirits of war brides who had leapt from cliffs after their villages burned, returning as demons to stalk the lonely and the desperate. And although Silas didn't put much stock in ghost tales, something about the way the figures watched him, motionless yet alert, as though waiting for him to draw closer, stopped him cold. Copper snorted uneasily, backing up, but a sharp, pained cry from across the creek cut through the twilight, a sound that wasn't ghostly at all but human and hurting, the kind of sound a man couldn't ignore no matter how long he'd been trying not to feel anything. And so Silas nudged the horse forward, hand resting near his holster but not on it, because he didn't want to greet strangers with fear, only caution. As he reached the bank, he saw that one of the masked women had collapsed, her hands trembling over a blood-soaked gash running down her thigh, while the other two hovered protectively over her, eyes flashing with distrust but also something else, exhaustion, desperation, the universal language of people who had run too far for too long. Silas raised his hands slowly, palms out, saying in a steady voice scraped raw by years of silence, "I ain't here to harm nobody." And though he doubted they understood his words, he hoped they grasped his tone. One of the women, tall, her braid thick as a rope, her eyes sharp as obsidian, shifted her weight, revealing she carried not a rifle or revolver but only a stone knife chipped from river flint, a tool more for survival than battle. And Silas realized these weren't demons, nor warriors, but refugees. Something or someone had chased them into his corner of the desert. With the sun sinking fast and the shadows lengthening like fingers across the sand, Silas made a decision he hadn't made in more than a decade. He chose to help. He slid off Copper, knelt slowly beside the wounded woman, and murmured, "Let me see," allowing her companions time to stop him if they wished, but instead they exchanged nods of weary surrender. And when Silas lifted the torn buckskin, he saw that the wound wasn't from a fall or a scrape but from a bullet, clean in, ragged out, and his heart tightened because that meant trouble was close behind them, the kind of trouble that traveled on horseback and carried rifles. Working fast, he tore strips from his own shirt, packed the wound, and created a rough tourniquet, all while the masked women watched him with an intensity that felt like being judged by the desert itself. When he finished, he said, "My ranch ain't far. She needs rest, water, and clean bandages. You're welcome there if you'll trust me." And though the tall woman hesitated, her gaze fell on her injured sister. Silas could see it in the way she touched her shoulder, a gesture soft as the hush of wind over sand. And finally she dipped her head in assent. Together they lifted the wounded woman onto Copper, and Silas led the way through the purpling dusk, feeling an unfamiliar sensation stirring in his chest, something he had buried long ago but recognized instantly. Purpose, the dangerous flicker of caring again. He didn't know who these women were or what hunted them, but as the first stars pricked the darkening sky, Silas Crowley knew one thing for certain. The desert had brought them to him for a reason, and whatever came next, he would face it with the same stubborn grit that had kept him alive all these years, because a man who has lived alone too long will do anything, to protect the first souls who make him feel less like a ghost and more like a man again. And somewhere deep inside, beneath all the dust and silence, a spark lit that said this was only the beginning, and that the danger tracking them was far darker and far more human than the ghost stories whispered across the frontier. The night settled over Crowley Ranch with a weight that felt older than the land itself. A black velvet sky lit only by a crooked moon and the faint glow of Silas's lantern as he ushered the three Apache women into his battered homestead, its timber walls creaking like the ribs of some ancient beast awakening after decades of sleep. The injured woman lay on Silas's only bed, breathing in shallow, uneven pulses, while her two companions stood near the door like sentinels carved from obsidian. their eyes reflecting the lantern's flame with a mixture of suspicion, grief, and the thin thread of hope that strangers rarely offered in the desert, and Silas, moving with gentle purpose, added wood to the stove until a small but steady warmth spread through the room, the first warmth he had shared with another soul in years. As he boiled water and rummaged for the few medicinal herbs Maria once kept, sage, willow bark, dried goldenrod, he caught the gaze of the tall woman, who finally removed her clay and ash mask, revealing a face carved by hardship yet striking in its quiet strength, high cheekbones glinting in the firelight, eyes deep and dark with stories he could only guess at, and she spoke softly in Apache, a string of syllables Silas couldn't understand but whose meaning was clear enough in the way her voice trembled. Gratitude mixed with fear. He nodded, answering in English, "You're safe here, least for now," knowing full well safety was a fragile promise in a land where bullets rode faster than prayers, and as he cleaned the wound again, he noticed the bullet had torn not only flesh but part of a ceremonial pattern dyed into the woman's buckskin, a symbol Silas faintly recognized from old trader tales, something sacred, something signaling she was no common wanderer but someone of significance to her people. Before he could ask anything, the tall woman touched her own chest and said, "Naylan," then gestured to the unconscious woman, "Dasodaha," and finally to the third, smaller woman with a hawk's alertness in her eyes, "Yus." Silas repeated their names carefully, earning a subtle nod from Yus as if confirming he had passed an unspoken test, and then Naylan pointed to Silas, asking with her gaze. He swallowed, surprised at how difficult it felt to say his own name after so many years of silence, but he managed, "Silas, Silas Crowley," and Naylan repeated it with a softness that stirred something warm in Silas's chest, something almost forgotten, but warmth couldn't keep the dangers outside at bay, and soon Copper stomped restlessly in the small corral, ears pricking toward the horizon where faint echoes of distant hooves thudded through the stillness, too measured, too many, to be wild horses. Yus stiffened instantly, her shoulders tensing like a drawn bow, and Naylan stepped beside Silas, her jaw tightening as she whispered one of the only English words she seemed to know. "Soldiers." Silas's gut turned cold, because soldiers this far out weren't patrolling, they were hunting, and the realization struck him that these three women weren't simply running from danger, they were fleeing the U.S. cavalry, men who had spent years forcing Apache families from their homelands under the guise of peace, and if they found these women here, Silas would be branded a traitor, maybe even shot on sight. He looked at Naylan, who stood fiercely despite her evident exhaustion, and at Yus, who already clutched her flint knife, ready to defend Dasodaha with her life, and in that moment Silas made a choice not from logic or survival but from the place in his heart that had begun to thaw the moment he saw them at Tumble Creek. He would not hand these women over, no matter who came for them. He doused the lantern, plunging the room into darkness except for the faint orange glow of the stove, and whispered, "Don't make a sound," then slipped out the back door to crouch beside the corral fence, scanning the horizon as the thunder of hooves grew louder, closer, rhythmically violent, until shapes emerged. 8 mounted soldiers silhouetted against the moonlit dust, their rifles slung, their captain raising a lantern that cast a swinging beam across the barren land. Silas's heartbeat thumped in his ears like war drums, and he forced himself to breathe slowly, knowing one tremor, one careless movement could doom the women inside. The captain shouted, "Crowley, we know you're out here, looking for 3 Apache escapees, dangerous ones. Seen 'em?" And Silas felt a surge of anger flare in his chest because he had seen them, but nothing about them was dangerous, only hunted, wounded, desperate. He stepped forward into the lantern's edge, hands raised casually as if welcoming travelers rather than confronting threats, and replied with a voice smooth from years of solitude, "Ain't seen much, 'cept dust and jackrabbits," watching carefully as the soldiers studied him, suspicious yet uninterested in spending their night arguing with a worn-out rancher barely holding his land together. The captain leaned down, his eyes sharp, scanning the ranch house, and for a terrifying moment Silas thought the man would dismount and search, but instead he spit into the dirt and snarled, "If they come this way, you best report it. They're said to be witches. Demons," words Silas recognized from the same ignorant tales he heard in saloons, tales meant to dehumanize, to justify cruelty, and Silas gave a lazy shrug, playing the part of a man too tired and too broken to care, until the captain finally snapped the reins and led the riders off toward the northern ridge, their hooves echoing long after their lantern vanished behind the dark swell of desert hills. Only when the silence settled again did Silas release the breath he'd been holding, his palms slick with sweat, and he turned back toward the warm glow leaking beneath his cabin door, knowing the night's danger wasn't over at all. It had only begun, because lying to the cavalry meant consequences, and hiding Apache women marked as fugitives meant he had no way back to the quiet. lonely life he once knew. When he entered the cabin, Nayland met his eyes with gratitude heavy enough to break a man's ribs, and Dasodaha stirred weakly, whispering something in Apache that made Yasa's eyes brim with tears. Silas didn't understand the words, but he understood the feeling, trust, fragile and rare, placed entirely in him, a broken rancher who hadn't spoken to another soul in years. And as the fire flickered low, casting shadows that danced like spirits across the walls, Silas Crowley knew this was the night his life stopped being a slow fade into dust and became something fierce, something dangerous, something worth fighting for. And he had no idea that the choice he made tonight would ignite a chain of events stretching far beyond his ranch, far beyond the desert, into a legend that travelers would whisper for decades to come. Because sometimes salvation rides in unexpected forms, and sometimes the lonely are chosen to protect the hunted, no matter the cost. And if the viewers listening to this tale feel that fire stirring too, the fire of courage, of loyalty, of wanting to hear the next piece of this unfolding saga, then hit that subscribe button, join the trail, and ride with us deeper into the best Wild West stories ever told, because the journey is just getting started.